this with you. Let's see, share screen. And let's see, I think that may have done it. Can everybody see? Let me reach my desktop once again here. So I am actually, if you could see my my setup here, I have 3 monitors going here. So I have one monitor over here so I can see all of you in Zoom so I don't feel like I'm sitting all alone here. Another monitor that has my PowerPoint, and then I have some notes here on the screen. So I'll try to make sure I look right here at the notes on the screen and kind of in the background, just know that all of you are there. So good morning. My name is Christopher Hermalik, and I'm a professor of Spanish and the coordinator of Spanish and French in the World Languages Department at Onondaga Community College in Syracuse, New York. I'm also the past chair of the Actful Distance Learning Special Interest Group, and I'm a visiting scholar with the Language Matters Research Consortium in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Linguistics at Syracuse University. I'm very excited to be with you here today to present my talk titled Inclusive from the Start, Applying the Universal Design for Learning Framework to Higher Education. Before I begin, I would like to say thank you to Nestle for inviting me to give this talk to you today. And I'd like to thank Provost Sandvik as well for making this possible too. I'm truly honored to be able to work with each of you today, and I look forward to working together. I'm going to start with slide number 2 right now. I'm on slide number 2, and I'm going to copy and paste a link into the chat for you. It will take me just a moment to get to the screen that has the chat here. And I will copy that right in here for you in just a moment. So there's a bit.ly link here. I just copied and pasted in the chat. And this link basically is for the PowerPoint presentation that's located on Google Drive. The link is, and I'll spell this out here for you. It's http://bit.ly/ and then this is the tough part of it, capital HROMALIK. So basically it's my last name with the first letter capitalized, underscore, and then all caps, SUNYGAAD 2021. And that'll take you directly to the PowerPoint, and you can download it. And one thing you'll notice is that in the notes of the PowerPoint, there's a transcript that I'm going to be following. And I say following, I'm going to be more or less following it. The idea is you can follow along while the talk is going on, but if for some reason I skip a slide or decide that there's something more important that we'll focus on, you can then go back through and review specific parts of the talk after, maybe things I didn't get to. And the idea is you can walk away and kind of almost have this presentation with you as you go away. So I'm on slide 3 right now, and Universal Design for Learning emphasizes the importance of establishing learning goals. And I like to also create learning objectives that show how those goals can be reached by students. With Universal Design for Learning, it's best not to specify the mode by which the goals and objectives are to be reached, as we'll want to ensure flexibility in the way students demonstrate their knowledge. So I'll start my presentation today by saying that my overarching goal for each of you today is for you to leave this talk knowing more about UDL and how it can be used to mitigate barriers to learning in the classroom. And by the time I'm done with this talk, you should be able to do the following. Define universal design for learning and learner variability. Identify barriers to learning in the post-secondary classroom. Provide UDL-based solutions to address barriers to learning in higher education. And apply small steps, and I call these the small steps. These are kind of like first steps you can take in UDL to one of your own courses. I'm on slide 4 right now, and I'd like to start off by reminding everyone today that this is a safe space to work together. We're all learning here, and I'll admit myself included too. We're all learning together with the overall goal of how can we help our students. There are going to be some things we know and some things that others know that we don't know. So we want to understand that we're working together. We're learning from each other. And where that's important is respect is going to be key today. So we want to make each other feel comfortable as we work to improve learning outcomes for our students. I'm on slide 5 now, and today I'm going to work with you on Universal Design for Learning, UDL. But before we talk about UDL, I'd like to talk about learner variability. I'm on slide 6, and my first question for you is this. Did you start a new hobby this year? Or did you learn anything new recently? Or maybe anything during the COVID-19 lockdown? For example, some of you may have learned to bake bread. Maybe you learned to sew, or you learned to knit. Go ahead and type in the chat, or raise your hand using the reaction button, or somehow let us know. Type in the chat if you learned something new this year, or if you want to raise your hand, and we can have you say aloud what you learned this year. Let's see if we can share a few things that we learned this year. Ooh, I'm seeing some interesting things coming through. So I'm seeing basket weaving. Oh, neat, really neat. Taking care of plants. Excellent. Learned to knit, meditation. I started running 1,000-piece puzzles. Interesting, interesting. Yep. Acrylic painting, new musical skills. Wow, lots of different things coming through. The last one here, amigurumi. I'm not exactly sure what that is. Jamie, would you be able to give a brief explanation about what amigurumi is? And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's interesting. I don't know what that is. Puzzles, start up a business, crochet, hiking. Oh, wow, hiking, that's a great idea. DIY, neat, excellent. Oh, that's something I really wish I had learned to do. Walked over, lots of great things. Spanish language skills now. That one I'm happy about for sure. So looking at all these great examples, I might ask you then, how did you learn? Did you read a book? Did you view a video on YouTube? An online recipe? Did a friend guide you over FaceTime or Zoom? Oh, and Jamie says it's crocheting animals or inanimate objects, giving them facial features. Oh, interesting. That does sound like fun. Yep. How did you learn your new skill? Endless Zoom. Help from a friend, also bought a book. Okay, excellent. Read all the Outlander books. App, talking to people, YouTube, everything. So that's interesting. I'm going to come back to some of these in just a second here. And you don't have to put this one in the chat. You can just ask this one of yourself. Did anything, and I'll put this in quotes, work better for you than any other ways? Did you maybe consult more than one source of information? And what I'm seeing as I'm looking at this is many of you have put in here, such as YouTube, book, trial and error, app, talking to people, YouTube, everything, repetition, video, blogs. It seems like many of you may have consulted one source of information, and many of you consulted 2, maybe 3 sources of information to learn. And so we want to remember the same is true for our students. We're all different in how we learn. Each of us had a different way that we learned this new skill over the last year, or over the last year and a half. And some of you learned in more than one way. This is going to be the same for the students that we teach. I'm on slide 7 now. The idea behind learner variability is that each of us is somehow unique in the way we learn. Where this becomes important is when we consider how we design instruction. There isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to teaching that's going to work for all learners. I'm on slide 8 right now, and I'd encourage you to each view Todd Rose discuss the myth of average. In the interest of time today, I'm not going to show you the video, but I'd like to summarize what he says. Mr. Rose tells the story of a problem in the Air Force in 1952. The Air Force had built state-of-the-art planes, but then when they went to test how pilots were flying, they found that pilots were flying worse than ever before. It turned out the problem was that the cockpits had been designed for the average pilot, assuming that it was going to fit most pilots. They conducted a study of 4,000 pilots to see how many of them were average on 10 dimensions of size: height, weight, length of arms, length of legs, that sort of thing. Oh, and thank you, Nasli, as well, for putting that link in the chat. If you go to look for this later, if you were to do a Google search for Todd Rose myth of average, it will come up for you. So you'll be able to watch that later on. And so when they conducted the study of 4,000 pilots, they found that none of the pilots were average on all 10 dimensions of size. So what happened was, instead of helping
working on my cross stitch.
So instead of helping everyone, it turned out that designing the cockpits to fit the average person ended up helping nobody. They eventually solved this problem by using some of the things that we take for granted anymore now. Our cars today have adjustable seats that move forward and they move backward to adjust for height. We have steering wheels that move forward and backward. In other words, they solved the problem that they had by creating a more flexible environment, a flexible cockpit. And so Rose goes on to explain that learners are not average on all dimensions of learning either. Some learners excel, or they're excited at math, while others are going to be more, well, language aficionados like myself. So by providing a flexible learning environment, we have a greater chance of being able to provide a successful learning experience for the many students we teach each semester. I'm on slide 9 right now. Universal design for learning is a way to address learner variability in the classroom. But what is universal design for learning? And I'll refer to this as UDL many times throughout this presentation. I'm on slide 10. Before we talk about universal design for learning, let's briefly start with universal design. By following the principles of universal design, it is possible to design products from the start to be accessible and usable by all. But what does this actually mean? Let's look at some examples of universal design so that we understand what it is, and also so we don't confuse it with universal design for learning, because universal design for learning is how we'll address learner variability in our classrooms. I'm on slide 11, and curb cuts are a classic example of universal design in action. So the image you see on the slide right now is of a sidewalk without a curb cut. So what we see here is we see that the sidewalk ends abruptly and then goes directly down to the street. There isn't a smooth transition from the sidewalk down to the street. This makes it difficult for a person using a wheelchair to move from the top of the sidewalk down to the street below because of this abrupt drop down to the street. The second image on here is of a curb cut. And a curb cut is a ramp that connects the top of the sidewalk down to the street below. And curb cuts serve many purposes. First, a person using a wheelchair is able to descend from the top of the sidewalk down to the street level because of this ramp, because of this curb cut that's there. But what makes universal design interesting is that when we design for accessibility and usability from the start, it has additional uses that may not have even been considered in the first place. For example, the bumps, and it may be a little hard to see here, these bumps, but there are bumps in this yellow piece at the bottom, and these bumps at the bottom allow someone who is blind to know when the street ends. And in addition, oops, my pen just went completely off the screen. I'm not sure what happened there. My apologies for that. In addition, you have these bumps that can help someone who's blind to know when the street ends. But in addition, it's much easier to push a child in a stroller when there are curb cuts available than when they're not. I still remember my daughter was born in Ithaca, New York. And so in Ithaca, there were a lot of curb cuts everywhere. So taking her for a walk was really easy because I would just go down the curb cuts, up the curb cuts. But then when we took her on vacation, I won't even mention the place where this was, but there were none. It was very difficult we basically have to lift her every time we went shopping, anytime we went walking with her. And so this was something that helped us, even though it wasn't even originally designed for me. I'm on slide 12. Another example are automatic doors. So in the first image we see here, we see an accessible entrance that opens when someone waves their hand in front of a sensor. And automatic doors provide an accessible entrance for someone who uses a wheelchair. But automatic doors benefit everyone. Personally, I've benefited greatly from automatic doors when I've had to carry heavy luggage through the airport. I'm on slide 13 right now. Many of us are also aware of how important closed captioning is. Instead of requiring people who are deaf or hard of hearing to purchase an expensive closed captioning box for the television, closed captioning is available in all television sets. As you probably know, closed captioning allows content to be shared with deaf and hard of hearing television viewers. But you may or may not know that it's also helpful to others. So for example, I personally wake up early in the morning every morning to watch TV in Spanish. And I'm very thankful when closed captions are available, because when I watch a TV show in Spanish, there may be a word I don't understand here and there. So that helps me to be able to rewind, turn on the captions, and find out, oh, okay, that's what they were saying there. Closed captions are also helpful in our house when my daughter wants to watch TV after dinner. We have an open floor plan, and it's sometimes difficult for my daughter to hear the TV in the living room when my wife or I wash the dishes in the kitchen. So by considering the many people who use a product, universal design allows for products to be accessible and usable from the start by all. In addition, universally designing a product provides additional benefits. So in the interest of time, let's just take just a moment here. I want to make sure that we all have a chance to contribute here. Let's take a look at slide 14 for just a moment. We're just going to take just a brief moment to look through this. I might ask you, can you think of any other examples of universal design or any other universally designed products that you can think of? You want to write that in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and we can have you say it aloud is fine too. Yes, talking my phone to text. Yes, excellent. Yep. Yes, that's a great example. Fantastic. Oh, audiobooks. That was one of the examples I'd come up with that I put in my notes, as some of you will see when you look at the PowerPoint. Yes, audiobooks are a great example. As audiobooks, the original purpose was to help people who were blind or who had low vision to be able to access the content in books. But now audiobooks are commonly used by everyone on the go. Moderate level code hooks. Oh, interesting. Yes. Yep. So especially too, if we have, there are many adjustable systems within closets too. Yep. Classroom work tables are easily adjustable. Yes, definitely. Yep. GPS. That's an interesting one. I'm not sure if that would be universal design or not, but either way, GPS has changed our world. I just recently read an article about how much GPS has changed our world. Yes, instead of having to read a map. Yep. Oh, good point. Yeah, instead of having to read a map, it reads the directions aloud to you. Yep. Yeah, I just read a really interesting article about just how much our world has changed because of GPS. It's pretty amazing. So quite a lot of things that we come up with, great examples. I appreciate everyone sharing these examples. The other one I give is typically is the electric toothbrush. So it was originally created to assist people who may have had limited motor skills, but now we see dentists recommend them to help all people keep their teeth clean. So I think we get the idea. We get the idea of what universal design is, right? Let's look at slide 15 together. Universal design for learning extends the idea of universal design to the classroom. And so CAST, and that's spelled C-A-S-T, they're the organization which created the Universal Design for Learning framework, and they continue to support inclusive educational practices. They say that UDL, Universal Design for Learning, is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn. And the idea is that if we design learning to be accessible and usable by all from the start, it will serve all students better. There will be no need to retrofit or scramble to find solutions for a student. When UDL principles are followed, we can provide instruction that is accessible to students with disabilities, but at the same time, we can make a better learning experience for all. I'm on slide 16 right now. There are 3 UDL principles. First, all of us are interested in different topics. We learned earlier that some of us learn different hobbies. What was interesting to one of you wasn't interesting potentially to somebody else. Although many of those things that I saw were really interesting, I would love to be able to learn them. Since learners differ in what they find interesting in a classroom, we can provide multiple means of engagement. This principle emphasizes providing options to learners to gain their interest and help them to become more self-regulated. Since learners are also different in how they perceive information, we provide multiple means of representation. This means providing options for how learners access instruction to address variability in perception. Finally, since learners differ in how they express themselves, the third principle of UDL is multiple means of action and expression. This involves providing options for demonstrating knowledge. So in short, these three principles are about flexibility. Flexibility in how we present content, flexibility in how students demonstrate their knowledge, and flexibility in how we pique their interest in the classroom. I'm on slide 17 right now, and there are three terms that I'd like to clarify before continuing. Accessibility is the extent to which information can be perceived by all. This means that we have made sure the information in a document, a presentation, a film, a TV show, that this information can be perceived by all people regardless of ability. When we hear the term compliance used, it tends to refer to accessibility. This is the bare minimum we should be striving for in our classrooms, making content accessible. Usability goes beyond accessibility and refers to the extent to which a product can be used by all. So an example of the difference between accessibility and usability might be a web page. It's possible to make a web page accessible, but if it isn't tested with many users, it may not be obvious to all how to accomplish a task, such as paying an online bill, purchasing a product, or submitting an assignment to a learning management system such as Blackboard. Another example of this is a paper exam shared with a student as a Word document. Such an exam might pass an accessibility checker in Word, but unless we design this test with usability in mind, it may be very difficult for a student using a screen reader to complete the exam in a reasonable amount of time. And finally, universal design for learning goes beyond accessibility. With UDL, one designs from the start, following the principles and guidelines of the UDL framework to ensure a wide range of students can engage in the learning process. UDL is meant to help all learners overcome barriers. If instruction is universally designed, it should ideally support students with disabilities, but it should also make for a more socially just and equitable learning experience for all. I'm on slide 18 right now. When we talk about universal design for learning, there are a few things to keep in mind. First, UDL is about more than just good teaching. As Dave Eddyburn states, if UDL were just good teaching, then why do we continue to see stark differences in achievement between students of all ages? UDL is more than just good teaching. It requires proactively making changes to how we teach to help all learners be successful. I'm going to share some strategies with all of you today to help you get started, but I'd highly encourage you to read more and learn more. Universal design for learning is about designing from the start to consider barriers to learning for all students. UDL means thinking about disability, social justice, equity, learner variability, all of these things during the design process. It's about being proactive and not reactive. So ideally, UDL should begin when a course is being designed, or in many cases, when we go about redesigning our courses. And it shouldn't take place the moment an accommodations form is presented to an instructor. Finally, we saw some examples of universal design earlier. And universal design for learning is based on a similar idea to universal design. We want to design something from the start to be accessible to and usable by all. But the principles of universal design and universal design for learning are different, and universal design for learning is appropriate for designing instruction. I'm on slide 19 right now. And let's summarize. Let's bring this all together before we move on. CAST, that's C-A-S-T, defines UDL as a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn. It doesn't mean that these are hard and fast rules that must be followed. It's a framework, and this framework provides guidance to instructors on how to remove barriers that impede student success. There are 3 principles: multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression, and multiple means of engagement. And I like to think of it as requiring a change in mindset, a change in how we think about how we design instruction. The idea is that faculty will proactively design from the start, keeping in mind the students with whom they either know they work with or could work with. This way, instructors avoid retrofitting instruction. I'm on slide 20 right now. And we've learned a little bit about UDL, a little bit about learner variability. Rather than have you listen to me the whole time, I want to see if we can maybe interact just a little bit here in the chat and think a little bit together about barriers to learning. Now, granted, I realize we've been going now for maybe 20 to 30 minutes at most. And so going in and thinking about trying to identify barriers may seem a bit overwhelming right now. But let's work together. I want to see if we can maybe look at some case studies and start to think, well, could we identify some barriers to learning in here? Then later on, after we see a few examples of UDL in action, we'll start to think about how could we then apply some of these UDL-based strategies to help to mitigate these barriers to learning. I'm on slide 21. And for each of these case studies, I'd like us to first identify barriers to learning. And here's how we're going to do that. I'm going to ask 4 questions as we analyze each case study. And these are 4 questions you can be asking about your own lessons as you design them over the summer in anticipation of the fall. Now, I'll first ask about the strengths of the lesson. It's very easy to poke holes in, especially when we're talking about other people's instruction, or especially when we talk about case studies like these. It's very easy to poke holes. And my dissertation chair would always say, and I always keep this in the back of my mind, she always said, instruction can always be improved. And she's 100% right. We can always find something we can improve. And especially if you have somebody come and observe a lesson or take part in an online course, they can always find something to improve. But I want us to think about, what do we like about the instruction too? I'll ask if there are potential barriers to how information is presented and perceived by students in a lesson. We'll consider barriers to how students demonstrate their knowledge in the lesson. And finally, I'll ask if there are barriers to student engagement and interest in the lesson. So as you can probably imagine looking at these, we're basically looking at these cases through the lens of the UDL framework and its 3 principles: multiple means of representation, multiple means of action expression, multiple means of engagement. I'd like to start with slide 22. I do feel a little bad for anyone teaching math. I don't mean to put math on the spot. I also don't mean to put freshman composition on the spot later on, but you'll see that I also turn the mirror back on myself as a Spanish instructor with a case study later. Depending on how much time we have, we may or may not get to all these case studies, but the idea would be you could also take a look at some of them on your own time afterwards with the presentation. You can download the PowerPoint and work through some of them on your own time too. So again, I don't want to make it seem like all math courses are a problem or anything. I don't mean to put any disciplines on the spot when I do this. But the first case does come from a college algebra course. And so I'd encourage you to take just a moment. I'm going to read the problem to you in a second, but I'll let you have a moment to read that on your own. The problem statement reads that many students find it challenging to solve problems involving simultaneous equations. So solving simultaneous equations requires following multiple steps with a high level of accuracy. Students find it challenging to follow the same steps when they try to solve simultaneous equations on their own. And as a result, many do not perform well on the chapter test. In terms of the current assignment or instructional method, the instructor demonstrates how to solve simultaneous equations on the chalkboard. Students copy from the chalkboard to their notebooks. Students are assigned practice problems from their textbook to practice in class and as homework. They take a written test without notes at the end of the chapter. So let's work through this together for just a moment. And again, I don't mean to put any discipline on the spot. We could take a look at this case study and apply it to so many other disciplines. I just thought this would be a good one that we could start with here. My question, the first one I'd like to ask is, what do you see as the strengths of this when we're looking at it? What are some of the strengths of this lesson as we look at it? Because there are many strengths. What kind of strengths do you see here? You're welcome to write in the chat, or if it's easier, you're welcome to also use the reaction to raise your hand, and we could say some of these things aloud too. Yes, that was one of the ones I thought of too. The instructor is demonstrating it. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's an excellent, that's exactly it. The instructor is demonstrating it. This is what's happening here. Yes, that's the other one I thought of. Yep, the instructor probably worked through many examples that work faster than students. Yes, practice. Practice is the other one. These are the two things that I thought of. Opportunities to practice. Students work on practice problems in class. I like that one. There's structure to the lesson too. So a lot of great things going on here, right? There's this demonstration of the simultaneous equations, right? There's this opportunity to practice. It's not just that they're seeing something and they're listening to the instructor just talking to them. There's this opportunity to practice, right? Students copying it for themselves. Exactly. Yep. Exactly. Assessment. Yep. There is assessment there. And the assessment, as it's being described here, I mean, we can, again, we can infer a lot of things from this. This assessment does really seem to target the construct of interest, because we're learning about simultaneous equations, then we're taking this test and it's assessing on whether or not they can actually solve them, right? There's a lot of great things going on here. And so I don't want to make it seem like I'm just poking holes in chalk and talk. I mean, there are many great things about it. But I want to look to see if we can try to find some barriers to learning in the case study, things that might be barriers to learning for many students. How about how information is presented to and perceived by students? What do you think about that? Is there anything that could be a barrier here to how students? Yes, excellent. So the first thing, and I appreciate it, thank you very much for sharing this one. Copying lecture and taking written tests might be difficult for someone who has limited motor skills. That could be challenging. I would also encourage us to think about a student who might have a learning disability or a student with a cognitive disability. It might be challenging for them to look and see what's written on the board, process the information, determine what's important to take from that information, and then continue writing it. So there's a lot of steps involved in that. And for some of us, those are steps that are going to be, we take them for granted, but it's something we don't want to take for granted. We want to think about everything that's involved. That's a very high cognitive load. Reading the chalkboard, exactly. Reading the chalkboard itself. So this, and there are many reasons why this can be challenging for everyone. This could be difficult for somebody who is blind or has low vision. But if we think about someone who is working with an interpreter, someone who is deaf or hard of hearing work with an interpreter, it's very difficult to pay attention to more than one stream at a time. So looking to see what's on the chalkboard, paying attention to what the interpreter is conveying to them, very difficult to do, exactly. Difficult hearing the teacher at the same time as taking notes. Exactly. Feedback in each step of the problem so they can identify where they're going wrong. Exactly. So lots of things here, right? So let me just show kind of some of the things that I'd come up with. Some of the things I thought of just as I was working through this. I'm on slide 23 right now. And I broke these down into providing multiple means of representation, providing multiple means of action expression, and providing multiple means of engagement. Now, in terms of representation, we want to keep in mind, just as you mentioned in the chat, not all students can perceive the information that's on the chalkboard. And we want to keep in mind there's a very heavy cognitive load here. There are many steps, and each step requires a high level of accuracy. So there are many steps to follow, and it's difficult to know here based on what's in this case study. Are these steps really explained clearly to students, or are the steps simply written on the board to be copied? And one thing we didn't bring up as well is, what about handwriting? So and this was something that came up. My wife is an electrical engineer, and so we were talking about how sometimes handwriting, it can be difficult to tell a letter V from a letter W from a letter R. So these are different letters that can sometimes, depending on someone's handwriting, be difficult to interpret. And so this is also another barrier to learning for any student that's sitting there in the classroom. Let's talk about action expression now. I'll give you a moment to look at this before I talk about it. So the test and the practice assignments, they're paper and pencil only. So that could present a barrier, right? In addition, there doesn't appear to be any scaffolding provided to students to help them know how are they going to apply what they've learned to these practice assignments. So when I say scaffolding, I'm talking about a support of some sort, something that's going to help them, supporting them as they're working through some of the practice assignments. And it's perfectly fine that on the test, they don't have any sort of supports, any sort of notes. That's not a problem at all, if that's how you would like that to be taught that way. But how about some support for them while they're practicing until they're able to get to that test situation? Finally, in terms of engagement. So there are two things that I thought about. And again, I created these case studies, but at the same time, I didn't put a lot of information. I'm just inferring some things from them. I wonder if students see the relevance of simultaneous equations, or if maybe that could be made more clear to them. Excellent. Great point here that's just brought in the chat. The assumption that their notes would be the help in practice assignment may not be enough. And that's a good point too. We can't necessarily assume that just because they have notes that they're going to necessarily be able to take what's in those notes and be able to apply it to the practice assignment. So we want to think about support. Exactly. We want to think about some support. Personally, as I'm thinking about engagement, I also wonder if the text and any word problems given to students, do they represent the diversity of the student body? So I'm putting this in the math case study example, again, not to put math on the spot, but this applies to all disciplines. It's important for us to think about whether our textbooks, our practice problems, our handouts, etc., are these representative of the diversity of the students with whom we work? Something to keep in mind as we think about textbooks, especially if we think about anyone who's choosing textbooks for the first time or for choosing a new textbook right now. Think about whether or not these textbooks, whether or not the student names that are used in practice problems and word problems, our handouts, do they represent the diversity of the students that we work with? So I want to bring up one more, and again, it's not to put freshman composition on the spot, but I also want to be mindful of time and be able to give you some other examples along the way and give you some time for questions too. The other case that I have here is from a freshman composition course. I'm going to pause for a moment and let you read the problem, and then I'll read it aloud to you. The problem statement here is that students do not perform well on the final essay of the course. In fact, many don't even attempt it. Those that do tend to submit assignments that are below the expectations of the instructor. The current assignment as written is found in the course syllabus, and it's distributed at the beginning of the semester. Students are told their final essay will be the following. You are to write an inquiry-based research essay of 8 to 10 pages. You must first develop a research question. After you finalize your research question, you will look for information to explore or answer the research question. Finally, you will write the essay and submit it to me, and in parentheses, the instructor. So I'll ask the same questions here. What are the strengths of this lesson? And there are many. What are some of the strengths of this lesson as we look at it? Feel free to write in the chat, or you're also welcome to raise your hand And we can say some of these ideas aloud. Yes, there are steps provided. Yep. So it does make the project more manageable. Yep. And I'm going to elaborate on that, actually, some of these steps, and we'll get into that. I think that's great that you brought that up. Students can choose their topic. Excellent. I'll get into that a little bit too. Specific guidance, 8 to 10 pages, inquiry-based. Yep. Excellent. Yep. Very good. These are great ideas. So how about barriers and how information is presented to and perceived by students in this lesson? Interesting. They need a grading rubric so they know what the specific expectations are. Yep, excellent. Provide samples, sources of essay writing. Right, a rubric. Yep. What are the criteria, right? No rubric. I love that so many people are saying this is great to see. Student may not understand the language of inquiry-based. Fantastic. What is an inquiry-based essay? Fantastic. That was, I piloted some of these case studies with some people and looked at it and they said, are we supposed to know what an inquiry-based research essay is? I said, nope, you're not. Not necessarily. What is a research question? Exactly. Is not specific on how to submit the assignment. They need practice opportunities. These are all fantastic. Inside of lingo. Fantastic. Oh my goodness. Wow. This is great. No drafting or peer review. This is very high stakes. Yes, I was going to say the rubric. And again, to explain the expectation, the purpose of the assignment. Everything that you're bringing up, fantastic. No models provided. Fantastic. Oh my goodness. I don't even have to ask all my questions. These are great. They're all coming through before I even get to all my questions. Is it given anywhere else beside the syllabus? It might be forgotten or lost. Excellent. Excellent. So they may demonstrate learning occurred on higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. That is a pro to yes. So what's really good about this is that they are able to demonstrate higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. That's excellent. I agree. That is definitely a strength of this. Does the question need to be approved, and when does that happen? Lots of questions even about how this works. I'm going to move on to slide 25 right now. Some students don't do well with open-ended research projects. Excellent, excellent, great. I mean, these are fantastic suggestions. I want to summarize some of the barriers here that I came up with, and I'm going to take a lot of these ideas. Some of the ideas that are in the chat here, I'm going to keep these in mind for next time when I revise this in the future. I want to start with representation. And so when I was looking at this in terms of representation, I wondered if the syllabus itself was even accessible, or is it available in a digital format? And this also gets to one of the ideas from the chat, this idea of, well, what happens if they lose the syllabus? Hopefully it's available in an accessible digital format, and hopefully in the learning management system. And one of the big ones here, and I love that multiple people had written this in the chat, what is an inquiry-based research essay? We don't know, based on the case study, if that important vocabulary has been clarified. And so the hope is that throughout the semester, they're learning what an inquiry-based research essay is. But if not, has important vocab been clarified? In terms of action expression, I question whether students know what the instructor actually expects of them. So if they're not reaching the expectation, does the instructor make it clear what's expected of them? I saw in the chat, one of the things was, well, is there a model or an example that students can follow? And that gets to the heart of that, do they know what's expected of them? Also, there are many steps to this. And one thing that was brought up, that the strength of this is that it says, do this, do that. But for each of those steps, was there a lot of guidance? It might be challenging for students new to research. And also I noticed one of the things brought up was, what about drafts? What about feedback? It's very high stakes. I wonder to myself, is it appropriate to have feedback for this final composition? I would like to think so, but again, this also depends on the instructor, but that's one of the potential barriers is there any way for feedback to be built into this at all? And finally, in terms of engagement, I wonder, do students choose the topics? And I imagine yes. I imagine yes, based on what I had written there in that case study. But what concerns me more is that there doesn't really seem to be any restriction whatsoever on the topic. So having the choice of literally everything can be overwhelming to students. So that may be something to consider as a barrier too. Is are we going to overwhelm students with so much choice? Now, just in the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of move through this one quickly, but I want to just let you know that I'm not just looking at other disciplines. I'm looking at turn the mirror on my own self or on just my own discipline in general. This is not how I teach vocab, but I'm just letting you know that I can turn the mirror on my own self too. I'll give you a second to read the problem, and then I'll give you some different barriers. We're here on slide 26, by the way. I apologize, I didn't mention that a moment ago. The problem here is that students find vocabulary difficult to learn in the course. They don't perform well in the vocab section of each chapter test. They find pronunciation to be especially challenging. And the current instructional method is that vocabulary is currently taught from a list at the end of each textbook chapter. The instructor reads the list of vocab aloud to students, asks them to repeat the pronunciation after them. Students complete vocabulary assignments in the paper student activities manual that accompanies the textbook. And just in the interest of time, rather than take suggestions, I'm going to just go directly to slide 27. And I'm going to just summarize a few barriers that just kind of quickly came to mind. In terms of representation, the textbook as described in the case is paper only. There's no e-text mentioned. There's also not much comprehensible input from the instructor. In terms of action expression, the assignments appear to be paper only with no digital option for students. And I also question whether there was any formative assessment. In other words, some sort of assessment for them to gather feedback and be able to know how to improve between the instruction and the chapter test. And finally, engagement. So I question the authenticity and the relevance of learning in the way that this is being described in the case. Do students see the relevance of vocabulary? Do students see the importance of communication in a language? Or do they simply believe they're learning vocab to take a test and pass a course? So I'm on slide 28 right now. Going back to our goal from earlier, I want to see how we're doing so far. I'm hoping that you can either provide a definition or some sort of explanation of what UDL is. Hopefully we can identify some barriers to learning. And let's move on now to talk about what UDL looks like in the classroom, and then start to see how we can apply some small steps in UDL to one of our courses before we take some time to answer some questions at the end. I'm on slide 29 right now. And I'm going to share some ways that identifying barriers and consulting the UDL framework can lead to innovative solutions. My hope is that we'll be able to apply some of these examples to our own classrooms as we work to design and develop our instruction for the fall. We'll also apply some of these to the case studies we just worked on. And what you'll see is all examples come from the Universal Design for Learning at Onondaga Community College. I'd like to briefly share some information about the UDL Academy before sharing the examples of UDL in higher education. I'm on slide 30 right now. At Onondaga Community College, we offered training in UDL to Onondaga Community College faculty, staff, and administrators for 4 years. This work took place with my colleagues William Myhill and Nancy Carr, and it began in 2016. Nancy Carr is the director of the Office of Accessibility Resources at Onondaga Community College. William Myhill was the director of the Onondaga Pathways to Careers project. William and Nancy proposed the idea of a multi-day UDL training for faculty, and they invited me to take part in the design and development of this training. The UDL Academy was funded by the Onondaga Pathways to Careers project through a grant from the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy. The Onondaga Pathways to Careers project prepared young adults with disabilities for skilled careers by providing them with the opportunity to enroll at Onondaga Community College, earn an industry-recognized credential, and acquire a job that pays a living wage in high-growth industries in the local workforce. William and Nancy wanted to provide support for faculty who were working with students who were registered at Onondaga Community College through the Onondaga Pathways to Careers project. They believed that a multi-day training in universal design for learning would be beneficial to faculty in the degrees leading to careers in high-growth industries that enrolled students from the Onondaga Pathways to Careers project. I'm on slide 31 right now. From 2016 to 2019, I was the faculty coordinator and lead instructional designer of the Universal Design for Learning Academy. We trained more than 110 faculty, staff, and administrators over the course of 4 years. We worked with approximately 20 participants at a time for 3 or 4 days each and provided information about the Americans with Disabilities Act, disability awareness and etiquette, accommodations, adaptive technology, universal design for learning, and information about students with disabilities on the OCC campus. I'm on slide 32 right now. We guided participants through the 5 steps of ADDIE as they worked to implement a UDL-based instructional intervention in a course that they believed presented a barrier to learners. ADDIE, A-D-D-I-E, stands for Analyze, Design, Develop, Implement, and Evaluate. And these are the 5 generic steps that are present in most instructional design models. First, we asked participants to analyze their current instruction and design a UDL-based instructional intervention during the summer training. Between the end of the summer training and the start of the fall semester, participants developed their instructional interventions and consulted with William, Nancy, and me as needed. Participants implemented their instructional interventions in the fall, and we assisted them in gathering data to evaluate the impact on students. If you're interested in learning more about the UDL Academy, we published an article in the journal Tech Trends in 2020, and we just recently have a new article that's in press with the International Journal of Inclusive Education. In the interest of time, I'd like to skip to slide 35, please. And I want to share some examples of UDL projects that were created as part of the fall project phase of the UDL Academy. And again, I skipped to slide 35. In each of these examples, faculty began with a barrier to learning and consulted the UDL framework to find innovative solutions that would remove these barriers for learners. I'd like to begin with an example from Human Services. The instructor of the course focused on Unit 3 of her course, which involved listening skills, ethics, and generalist skills for professionals in human services careers. The barrier to learning she encountered was that students were oftentimes not successful on the written exam for the unit. The instructor also felt it was no longer exciting to teach this unit. The instructor focused on UDL checkpoint 7.1, which states to optimize individual choice and autonomy. This instructor created a professional identity project. It replaced the written exam, and it was an 8-page portfolio to help students form their own professional identity by explaining how the concepts from the unit, that is, things such as ethics, listening skills, professional skills, applied to their work in their chosen career path. The instructor also followed UDL checkpoint 5.2, which states to use multiple tools for construction and composition. The instructor created guided notes pages for textbook readings, posted as accessible Word documents on Blackboard. In addition, there was flexibility in completing the project within the stated directions. This helped to reduce the barriers to completing the assignment that were seen with the traditional paper and pencil test. I'm on slide 36. Another example comes from American Sign Language. The activity that was considered was one in which students learned campus buildings vocabulary from a walking tour of the campus. The barrier to learning that had been encountered was that some students might not be able to take part in the walking tour. UDL checkpoint 2.5 states to illustrate through multiple media. The instructor created a captioned video of the walking tour and posted it to YouTube. And this video also serves additional purposes. And it's also a lot of fun too. You can, if you were to, if anyone is interested in actually seeing the video, I'd encourage you to email me. I'd be happy to share that link with you. I just, in the interest of time, won't show it today, but it's a fantastic video. Its main goal was to ensure that the campus walking tour was accessible to someone with limited mobility. However, it also ensured that any student who couldn't complete the walking tour would have an equivalent experience. In addition, this video is now used as an advanced organizer for this unit of instruction. In other words, the instructor provides the video to students online as a means of previewing the material for the unit and helping them to, in their mind, organize how the information will be presented for the entire unit on campus buildings. And finally, this video can be assigned as homework when a class is canceled for snow. I'm going to skip to slide 38. And I want to give another example from American Sign Language. So again, I'm on slide 38, and this involved a quiz that tested knowledge of adjectives of emotion. The barrier to learning, or the problem, was that the quiz, as it had been created before, provided a limited representation of the diverse student population with which this instructor worked. It was basically a half sheet of paper quiz with some drawings of people's emotions, like faces, basically. And what happened was, once the instructor realized that this quiz didn't provide a diverse representation of deaf individuals, the instructor also realized that certain aspects of how the quiz may have been perceived by students, such as those emotions that had been drawn, it might have been difficult for students to complete the test. So the instructor followed checkpoint 7.3 originally, which states to minimize threats and distractions. The instructor revised the quiz, and it now features famous people who are deaf or hard of hearing, and it's now a better representation of the diversity of deaf culture. The instructor revised it to be a full color page instead of a black and white page, and the instructor laminated it. The instructor also created an equivalent version on Blackboard. An equivalent, I should mention, equivalent accessible version on Blackboard. This activity benefited students by allowing them to see the diversity of deaf culture. However, there are also additional purposes. It was easier for students to perceive the paper version of the quiz now that it was in color. The Blackboard version of the quiz used alt text to help someone using a screen reader, but the alt text could theoretically help students better understand what emotion is depicted in each of the pictures. The assessment can be reused every semester, which saves time. The assessment is also used by any instructors who teach the course. And finally, with the transition to emergency remote instruction due to COVID-19, the Blackboard version of the quiz was ready for students who transitioned to learning at a distance. I'm going to skip to slide 40, and I provided a few examples from the humanities, but I'd like to give an example from mathematics. So again, on slide 40, the activity focused on students being introduced to eigenvectors, vector spaces, and linear transformations. The barrier to learning, or the problem that was encountered here, is that these are concepts that can be very difficult for students to grasp. The instructor was looking for ways to help students understand what are rather abstract concepts. The instructor turned to checkpoint 5.1, use multiple media for communication. The instructor proposed finding videos that would provide a visual demonstration of these concepts on a 3D plane. I also encouraged the instructor to not just show the video in class, but to also provide an oral description of what is seen in the video, and to provide a guided notes page to help students be able to work through what they're perceiving in that video. The use of a visual representation of these concepts is crucial in helping students understand what is happening when performing these calculations. However, by providing an oral description as a subject matter expert, this instructor was helping students who were blind or who had low vision. The oral description, oops, I apologize. The oral description was also helpful for a student with a learning disability. It helped to make salient the most important information of the visual representation, and it guided a student in summarizing the information to study later. I just want to add one more thing. I was really, when I asked permission of the instructor if I could use the slide today, this instructor added one more thing that came up in the conversation last week. He said he continues to develop instructional materials 4 years later. And so he's truly undergone this change in mindset. He's currently, this is so neat, he's currently building simple wood and plastic manipulatives in his home workshop. So he's creating these manipulatives to represent basis vectors and linear, I'm reading this just because this is coming from the email he sent me, and I don't even know what these things are, but he's representing basis vectors and linearly independent vectors, and he's going to debut them in fall 2021. Now, this is like way beyond, this is extra credit here, but and it's fantastic that he's still considering what he learned from the UDL Academy. He's thinking about how to support students who are blind or who have low vision. But if we think about it, these manipulatives also provide a 3D representation of really highly complex topics that are going to assist all students in better understanding what's typically represented only in like a two-dimensional page in a textbook. So really interesting ways of thinking through how are we going to make this information more accessible and usable and more universally designed for everyone. So in the interest of time, I have about 10 minutes and I want to stop for questions here. I want to look at these case studies again. And typically with a little more time, if I had left myself some more time, I might have allowed us to maybe go back and forth and try and find some solutions. I'm going to propose some solutions to these, but these are not the only solutions. These are just one way that we could possibly mitigate barriers in the case studies that we had talked about earlier in this talk. You will undoubtedly have other ideas too, whether that's based on some of the things I just showed you, maybe some of the small steps I'm going to show you in a few minutes, but these are just some ideas. And I'm going to go to slide 43 right now. On slide 43, I want to start with the college algebra example. Just to remind you, the problem was that students found simultaneous equations to be challenging. The assignment was chalk and talk, or the instructional method was chalk and talk, right on the board with some explanation from the instructor. I'm so sorry. I'd like to focus on barriers and representation here, because not all students can perceive what was written on the chalkboard. In addition, there's a heavy cognitive load because there are many steps to follow. So how can we mitigate these barriers? One way might be through an accessible guided notes page. This is a notes page that will ask questions and will guide the students through the steps needed to solve a simultaneous equation. And such a guided notes page would also be helpful when completing homework. Second, the instructor should be sure to describe aloud what they're writing and explain each of the steps. And remember, math is a language of its own, right? So clarifying the symbols of math while explaining what they are writing is helpful to students. Finally, posting any notes before class or even at the beginning of the semester, if possible, is helpful for all students. This is especially helpful for students who are blind or who have low vision. It's also helpful for students who are deaf or hard of hearing, or students who have a learning disability or a cognitive disability. Posting notes ahead of time is very helpful. I'm on slide 44, looking at the freshman comp example. Just as a reminder, the problem was that students did not perform well on the final essay of the course. The current assignment is an inquiry-based research essay. So with the math example, we focused on providing multiple means of representation. Here, I want to focus on providing multiple means of action and expression. And we saw the students may not necessarily know what the instructor expects of them. There are many steps, but no guidance, especially for students new to research. And what about feedback? So how can we mitigate these barriers? One way that came through the chat, and it's an excellent idea, is to provide a model essay or a rubric. This way students know what's expected of them. Maybe provide a checklist of steps. Break down some of those steps that were in the assignment instructions into some manageable steps that students could follow. And finally, maybe schedule checkpoints with feedback. This chunking of the project can provide support for students who might need help learning how to self-regulate their learning when they're in this introductory level course, learning to do research for the first time. And finally, the Spanish 101 case. I'm on slide 45. The problem was that students found vocabulary difficult to learn. And the current instructional method was to teach the vocabulary from a list. So there were many barriers to how information was perceived here, and also many barriers in terms of action expression. But in terms of barriers to engagement, I would question the authenticity or the relevance of this, of the way this was being done. So how can we mitigate these barriers? More authentic tasks. And so I agree, it's easier said than done, right? Create more authentic tasks. That sounds like, oh, so easy. Well, we know it's not, right? It does take a lot of planning to come up with these authentic tasks. For language teachers, and I imagine this applies to other disciplines, there are many resources available. Right now, all textbooks for languages, they really come standard now with integrated performance assessment tasks for each chapter. And those are going to be more authentic, recommended by our National Language Teaching Organization, ACTFL, which is ACTFL. And I imagine there are national teaching organizations for your disciplines. And I encourage you to look to see, maybe they can recommend ways to help with more authentic tasks as well. I want to skip ahead to slide 47 and try to finish the next just a couple minutes to give you some time for questions. Small steps. I want to look at some small steps you can do when you walk into the classroom again in the fall. I'm going to skip ahead to slide 48. And 48, you may remember that providing multiple means of engagement means to provide more options to learners to gain their interest and help them become more self-regulated. Opportunities for reflection are a quick way and a great way to help students be more engaged. Faculty can help learners set goals, break their goals into short-term objectives, reflect on how they performed on a quiz or an activity in class, and think about what they can do in preparation for the next test or the next class session. These assignments aren't really difficult to implement, especially if you're teaching a course at a distance using a learning management system such as Blackboard. Students can reflect every week and submit it to an assignment Dropbox in Blackboard or in whatever your learning management system happens to be on your campus. Another means of providing multiple means of engagement is by encouraging collaboration among students. And I'm sure many of us already provide clear goals for group activities, but asking students to each choose a role in their breakout groups online or in their cooperative groups in the classroom, such as maybe someone's the leader, someone is a scribe, someone's the reporter, someone is the questioner, pushing back and making sure that we've considered their options. That'll help them to play their skills and hopefully help them to be more engaged and less overwhelmed by some of the possibilities of potentially presenting to a group of students, especially on camera over Zoom, right? On slide 49, providing multiple means of representation means to account for differences in how learners perceive information. A quick UDL strategy to provide multiple means of representation is to upload PowerPoint presentations and Word document handouts to your learning management system ahead of class. If these documents are accessible, and they should be, it will help students who are blind or who have low vision. It also benefits students who work with an interpreter because interpreters benefit from viewing documents ahead of time. A student with a learning disability will benefit from printing a PowerPoint notes sheet ahead of time so they can be more prepared and organized in class. Students arrive to class prepared and they know what they're going to be doing in the classroom. Another small step you could take would be to provide a template, a graphic organizer, a guided notes page, or a concept map to support note taking. And in many cases, providing the PowerPoint ahead of time, that can serve as a guided notes page too. You can print it and students can write their notes right there as a guided notes page. And finally, on slide 50, providing multiple means of action and expression refers to providing options for how students demonstrate their knowledge. One quick way to do this is to estimate effort, resources, and difficulty of an assignment. You can do this by telling students how long a reading will take or how long an assignment might take. How do we know what to put there? Read it yourself and double the amount of time it takes you. UDL recommends providing a model, an example assignment to students. An easy way to do this is to reach out to a former student who completed a high-quality assignment and ask permission to anonymize and share their work. Remember that each institution has their own paperwork that needs to be filled out potentially for this. You may need the student to sign and give you permission to use it. Either way, it's really worth it in the time it saves answering questions about how to complete an assignment. And I'm sure we all have an assignment where we've received question after question about how are we supposed to do this or that. This helps to resolve those questions as an instructor, saving you time, and it helps students. Also, much like multiple means of representation, we oftentimes associate multiple means of action and expression with allowing students to use multiple media for communication. That doesn't mean that we now need to let students submit everything via an interpretive dance, right? But maybe consider options where there's flexibility. Could we allow students the choice of submitting a Word document or an image of a handwritten composition instead? So I give this example because this is what I had noticed in my own class. I had noticed students for years, they struggled to write diacritics. So diacritics are like the accent marks in Spanish, inverted question marks, the inverted exclamation point at the beginning of a sentence. And this slight change of saying, okay, you can submit it either as a Word document or you can take a picture of a handwritten composition. And all of a sudden, those questions went away. I'm no longer explaining how to write diacritics on a computer anymore. How about a class presentation? Could students use something else besides PowerPoint? So the idea really is keep in mind whether this alternative measure will measure the construct of interest. Is it going to get to that construct? What is it you're trying to measure? What are you trying to assess? And finally, another first step would be to check that there's sufficient support in assignment directions. It only takes a few minutes to clarify length requirements, citation formats, and also we mentioned earlier in the chat, providing a rubric ahead of time. So faculty can design their own rubric for assignments, but also getting back to national organizations. Our National Language Organization, for example, provides many rubrics that teachers can use. So this may be true of your national teaching organization. They may provide rubrics that you can just take and use for the taking. This information, also, we want to make sure that ensuring directions don't rely on color, shape, position, or size. So this information isn't conveyed to someone using a screen reader. A simple step faculty can take when it comes to something is maybe labeling a passage and referring students to that passage by its name. Let me give you an example. Saying in your directions, read the reading on the right. A student using a screen reader won't know what's on the right of something. Instead, if you say, read the reading titled Universal Design for Learning, label that reading Universal Design for Learning, and all of a sudden now the student will know where to find that if they're using a screen reader. Okay, so looking back at the goals, the objectives for the session one last time, I wanted each of us to leave here knowing more about UDL, knowing how it can be used to mitigate barriers to learning in the classroom. I set as an objective that we be able to define UDL and learning variability, identify barriers to learning in the post-secondary classroom, that we could provide UDL-based solutions to address barriers to learning in higher education, and that we could apply small steps in UDL to our courses. So I just ask, I have over here on the left-hand side over here, I see all of us here in Zoom, and I see 3 screens of Zoom participants, which is great to see. How many of you giving me a thumbs up reaction, going to reaction and clicking the thumbs up? How many of you feel that we got here today, that we reached our goals? What do you think? Yes, good to see, good to see. Yes, I'm seeing lots of thumbs up. Excellent, excellent. So I think we hit our target today. I think we're there. And so I'd encourage you to, of course, moving on to slide 52, to learn more. And if you're a faculty member, a great way to learn more is just implement one of those small steps in your course. Or go back to the PowerPoint, and we'll post the PowerPoint link again here in the chat in just a moment here for you. Go back to that PowerPoint and look at some of the examples. There are examples there that I didn't even get into with some description in the notes page that you can take a look at on your own. So go ahead, implement a strategy in your own course. I provide additional resources at the end of the PowerPoint, so you don't need to worry. I'm on slide 52 right now. Those last 6 or 8 slides we're not going to go through those at all. They're additional resources, so you don't have to worry about further death by PowerPoint here. Seek professional development. Find a workshop, find some training, something where you can learn some more. I think at the end I put learningdesign.org or learningdesign.com, I think it is, has some credentialing for universal design for learning. And so they can guide you through things like learner variability, so you can learn more. And finally, if you really get into it, offer a training or workshop of your own. Contact me if you need help with resources or other information on how you could do this at your own institution. So I'm on slide 53 right now, and I simply want to thank you all for allowing me to be here to give this talk with you today. I'd like to thank Nazli for inviting me and for working with me over the last few weeks to be sure all was ready for today. Big thank you to Provost Sandvik for allowing me to be here today too. A big thank you to both Nancy Carr and William Myhill for all their support for me as we work together on the UDL Academy together. And I've put 2 email addresses on the slide. One is my OCC address. It's HROMALIC, so a C, not a K, at sunyocc.edu. And thank you, Nazli. She just put in the chat. And the other is my Syracuse University address, which is cdhromal@syr.edu. So please feel free to contact me. Any questions you have. And I'm really looking forward to working with all of you in other sessions throughout the day. So I will be here and look forward to continuing to work together. And from slide 55 on, there's some additional resources, but slide 54 is where I'm at right now. And I can take questions here for another few minutes if Nazli wants, or if I don't know if we want to break, I'll turn to you here and see what you think.
Thank you for such a fantastic presentation, Dr. Romalik. Yeah, if anyone has questions, you may unmute yourself or put them in the chat. Also, feel free to take a little break. So we'll be here for another 9 minutes or so. Just seeing a lot of thank yous and praise in the chat.
It was very nice to be able to be with you today. And thank you, Colin, for sharing the information that you shared as well, too. And I look forward to talking with you more as well. I'm glad to hear one of the things that came up. I'm really glad to hear what you said about the textbook platform that you chose. We just chose that one, actually. And so I'm glad to hear that my research came up with some very good things, too. And so I'm glad to see that that was something that helped you be successful, too. And so thank you for your presentation today, too, Colin. I really appreciate that. Any questions I can answer for you? Anything I can help you with?
I think you did such a great job that no one has questions.
Well, if you want, let me go back real quick to the to my PowerPoint here. I'm going to take and post the link in here again, if I can find it here, and that way you can download the PowerPoint. I know there's a lot to digest here too. So typically with the UDL Academy, we would, over the course of 3 to 4 days. So some years we did over 3 days, some years we did over 4 days. It was a multi-day training. And so there's a lot here. There's a lot to digest. And so the idea was we would work together, we'd workshop some ideas. it wasn't an hour and a half. And so this is probably, I imagine, a lot of information right now. I'd encourage you to go through, take a look at the PowerPoint, read through it. The notes section has pretty much, more or less kind of what I was saying and what I would have said. And if it turns out you have questions, please feel free to email me. And I'd be very happy to answer questions or help you out, especially too if you're looking for resources, that sort of thing. I'm happy to help you out with that too.
Great. All right, well, let's take a 5-minute break. I think we can stop the recording, Victoria.